Private Billy Thompson presses back against the burning Sherman tank, feeling the metal sear through his uniform as German machine gun bullets sparked off the other side. The 19-year-old farm boy from Kansas had two choices: run across open ground and die instantly, or stay behind 8 tons of burning steel and probably die slowly. He chose a third option that would earn him the Medal of Honor. For the next 4 hours, Billy would push the flaming wreck forward using his rifle butt and shoulders, advancing yard by bloody yard toward German positions, while the tank's ammunition cooked off around him. 250 Wehrmacht soldiers couldn't believe what they were seeing. A single American was using their own destroyed tank as a mobile shield, and somehow, impossibly, he was winning. When ordinary people do extraordinary things in the face of death, their stories deserve to be told. If courage under fire inspires you, consider subscribing for more untold stories of heroism. December 15th, 1944, the Ardennes forest was frozen hell. The Battle of the Bulge had erupted unexpectedly, catching American forces off guard. Billy Thompson's unit, the 28th Infantry Division, had been shattered by the German offensive. His company was down to 30 men from an original strength of 190. They were retreating through the village of Wiltz when German forces caught them in the open. The Sherman tank that was supposed to provide cover took a direct hit from a Panzerfaust, killing the crew instantly but leaving the hull largely intact as it burned. Billy had grown up fixing tractors on his family's wheat farm, understanding machinery through necessity rather than education. When the Sherman was hit, he noticed something others missed. The fire was concentrated in the engine compartment and turret, but the main hull remained solid. The tracks, though damaged, could still roll if pushed. While his squad mates hugged the frozen ground, Billy made a calculation that seemed insane. The burning tank could become mobile cover if someone was crazy enough to push it. The first German machine gun nest was 300 yards away, perfectly positioned to massacre any retreat attempt. Billy waited until the tank's ammunition began cooking off, creating noise and smoke that masked his movement. He positioned himself at the rear of the tank, finding handholds on equipment racks. The metal was already hot enough to blister skin, but Billy had worked harvest seasons in 100-degree heat, his hands toughened by years of handling hot machinery. He began pushing. Sergeant Mike Rodriguez thought Billy had gone insane from combat stress. He watched the farm boy lean into the burning tank, legs driving like a football player pushing a blocking sled. The tank moved an inch, then a foot. German gunners, fixated on keeping American heads down, then immediately noticed the burning wreck creeping forward. By the time they realized what was happening and redirected fire, Billy had pushed the tank 20 yards, creating a shield that allowed 5 wounded soldiers to crawl to better cover. The physics should have been impossible. A Sherman tank weighed 33 tons. Even with damaged tracks, moving it required superhuman effort. But Billy understood leverage from years of freeing stuck farm equipment. He used his rifle as a pry bar when needed, found the exact angles where his strength multiplied through mechanical advantage. The frozen ground, which had been their enemy, became an ally as the tank slid more easily on ice than mud. German infantry commander Hauptmann Werner Kruger later testified about the surreal sight. His men reported a single American soldier advancing behind a burning tank, periodically stopping to fire his rifle through the smoke before resuming his push. Kruger initially dismissed it as battle hallucination until he saw it himself through binoculars. The American would push for 30 seconds, pause to breathe while bullets rattled off the tank's armor, then push again. It was either the bravest or most insane thing Kruger had witnessed in 5 years of war. The tank's ammunition continued exploding, sending fragments in all directions. Billy's uniform was shredded, his arms bleeding from dozens of small cuts. The heat was becoming unbearable, his hands leaving skin on the metal with each push. But he had momentum now, the tank rolling slightly downhill toward German positions. He began timing his pushes between machine gun bursts, using the Germans' own firing patterns against them. At 150 yards from the German line, Billy did something that defied all military logic. He stopped pushing and climbed partially onto the burning tank to get a better view. Through the smoke, he identified the primary machine gun position and threw 2 grenades with the accuracy of someone who'd spent years throwing hay bales onto high wagons. Both grenades found their mark, silencing the gun that had pinned down his entire platoon. The explosion of the German machine gun nest created chaos in their defensive line. Billy Thompson seized a moment, sliding back behind the burning Sherman and pushing harder than before. His platoon, inspired by his insane courage, began advancing in his wake. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez ordered covering fire, though most of his men were too stunned to do more than watch the farm boy turn warfare into something resembling a demolition derby. The burning tank had become a moving inferno. The rubber on the tracks was melting, creating toxic black smoke that made breathing nearly impossible. Billy tied his undershirt around his face, filtering the worst of the fumes, though his lungs burned with every breath. The metal he was pushing against had heated to over 300 degrees. His hands were now wrapped in strips torn from his jacket, the fabric smoking and charring as he maintained contact with the tank. German soldiers began focusing all their fire on the burning Sherman, hoping to detonate remaining ammunition or fuel. Bullets sparked off the armor in continuous streams, creating a light show in the smoke. Billy could feel impacts through the metal, each hit vibrating through his body. An 88mm round from a hidden anti-tank gun slammed into the tank's front, nearly knocking Billy unconscious from the transmitted shock. But the already destroyed Sherman absorbed the hit, its armor holding despite the damage. Private Danny Martinez, watching from a shell crater, later described what happened next as impossible to believe without witnessing. Billy began using the tank's own burning fuel to his advantage. As diesel leaked from ruptured tanks, it created a river of fire that flowed toward German positions. Billy adjusted his pushing angle, directing this flame river into enemy trenches. German soldiers abandoned positions they'd held for weeks, fleeing from the advancing wall of fire and steel. At 75 yards from German lines, Billy encountered a problem that should have ended his advance. A concrete dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacle blocked the path. The burning Sherman couldn't go over or around it. Billy studied the obstacle for 30 seconds while bullets chipped concrete around him. Then, he did something his farming background had taught him. He began rocking the tank back and forth, building momentum like freeing a truck from mud. On the 5th rock, the Sherman's weight cracked the frozen concrete. On the 10th, the obstacle crumbled enough for the tank to push through. Hauptmann Kruger ordered his men to rush the single American soldier, convinced that close combat would end this bizarre assault. 12 Wehrmacht soldiers charged from their trenches with bayonets fixed. Billy heard them coming through the smoke, dropped prone behind the tank's tracks, and opened fire with his M1 Garand. 8 shots, 8 hits. He reloaded with fingers, so burned they could barely feel the ammunition clips, then continued firing. The German charge faltered, soldiers diving back to cover, unable to comprehend how one man was holding off a reinforced company. The psychological effect on German morale was devastating. These were veteran troops who had fought in Russia, survived Normandy, and launched the Ardennes offensive with complete confidence. Now they were being pushed back by a single American teenager, using their own destroyed tank against them. Soldiers began abandoning positions without orders, convinced they faced some new American secret weapon rather than accepting the reality of one determined farm boy. Billy's advance had created a 300-yard corridor of safety for American forces. Wounded soldiers who had been trapped in no man's land crawled toward the burning tank, using its smoke and bulk as cover. Medics followed in Billy's path, evacuating casualties that would have been abandoned. An entire platoon of scattered soldiers were formed behind the mobile shield, turning Billy's solo charge into the spearhead of a counterattack. At 50 yards from the main German position, the Sherman finally stopped, not from enemy action, but because Billy collapsed. He had been pushing for over 2 hours, covering 400 yards of frozen, cratered ground. His hands were burned to bone. His uniform was more char than fabric, and he was severely dehydrated from the heat. He fell to his knees behind the tank, physically unable to continue, but his action had achieved the impossible. The Germans, seeing the tank stop, prepared for a final defensive volley. Instead, they saw 40 American soldiers emerge in the smoke behind Billy, charging with fixed bayonets and rage born from witnessing superhuman courage. The Wehrmacht line, already shaken by Billy's advance, crumbled. Soldiers who had held against overwhelming odds for days fled from the psychological impact of the burning tank and the man who had pushed it. Sergeant Rodriguez reached Billy first, finding him unconscious behind the still-burning Sherman. The farm boy's hands were unrecognizable, fused fabric and flesh creating makeshift gloves of scar tissue. His back showed third-degree burns where the hot metal had eaten through his uniform. Rodriguez thought Billy was dead until he heard weak breathing, somehow still regular despite smoke inhalation that should have killed him an hour ago. The medics who arrived called it impossible that Billy was alive, let alone that he had pushed a burning tank 400 yards. The German retreat had turned into a rout. What started as Billy's desperate action had broken the spine of an entire Wehrmacht battalion. Colonel James Patterson, arriving with reinforcements, found a battlefield that made no tactical sense. A single burned tank track led from American lines straight through German positions, surrounded by abandoned weapons and equipment. German soldiers had fled so quickly they left hot food in mess tins, ammunition and guns, and classified documents in command posts. Billy woke in a field hospital 12 hours later, his hands wrapped like a mummy's, morphine dulling but not eliminating the agony. The first thing he asked was whether his squad had made it out. When told that his action had saved 37 American lives and broken a German offensive that threatened to encircle the entire regiment, Billy's response became legend. Would have pushed it further, but the damn thing ran out of gas to burn. The interrogation of captured German soldiers revealed the psychological devastation Billy had caused. Unteroffizier Hans Mueller told intelligence officers that his unit believed they were facing a new American flame tank, remote-controlled and indestructible. When told it was one man pushing a destroyed Sherman, Mueller refused to believe it until shown photographs. He then asked to meet the American who had done this, wanted to shake the hand of someone who had showed more courage than Mueller had seen in 5 years of combat. Word of Billy's actions spread through both armies like wildfire. American morale, battered by the surprise German offensive, surged with the story of the Kansas farm boy who had turned agricultural stubbornness into military victory. General Patton himself visited Billy in the hospital, declaring that this was the kind of American fighting spirit that would win the war. When Patton asked Billy how he'd found the strength, Billy replied that he'd pushed heavier things during harvest season, though they usually weren't shooting at him. The technical analysis of Billy's feat stunned military engineers. They calculated that moving the Sherman required sustained force of over 2,000 pounds, factoring in the damaged tracks and frozen ground. Billy had maintained this force for 2 hours in combat conditions, while wounded behind burning metal. Sports scientists later compared it to running a marathon while bench pressing weights, all while being shot at. It shouldn't have been physically possible, yet dozens of witnesses confirmed every detail. Captain Friedrich Weber, the German officer who had commanded the defense, was captured 3 days later. His report to German intelligence, recovered after the war, described Billy's assault as the most demoralizing event his unit had experienced, not because they were defeated, but because of how they were defeated. One soldier with determination had negated every advantage they possessed: superior positions, greater numbers, better fields of fire. Weber wrote that if America could produce soldiers like this Kansas farm boy, the war was already lost. Billy's action had strategic implications beyond the immediate battlefield. The German offensive in this sector stalled completely. Commanders unwilling to commit reserves after hearing about the burning tank ghost who had broken an entire battalion. The delay allowed American forces to consolidate, bringing up reinforcements that turned potential disaster into eventual victory. Military historians credit Billy's 4-hour push with preventing a German breakthrough that could have prolonged the Battle of the Bulge by weeks. The medical report on Billy's injuries filled 12 pages. Besides the catastrophic burns, he had 2 cracked ribs from the tank's recoil when hit by the 88mm shell, severe dehydration, smoke inhalation damage that would affect his lungs permanently, and muscle tears throughout his back and legs from the sustained pushing effort. Doctors said he would never regain full use of his hands. Billy proved them wrong, though it took 18 months of agonizing rehabilitation. Letters from Billy's squad mates to his family in Kansas revealed the human impact of his actions. Private Joey Watson wrote that Billy had saved his life 3 times that day, once by creating cover for retreat, once by destroying a machine gun that had him pinned, and once by showing him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action despite terror. Every man in the platoon signed a letter stating that they owed their lives to Billy's impossible bravery. The ceremony took place on a crisp March morning in 1945 in a field hospital near Nancy, France. President Roosevelt had died weeks before, and it was President Truman's signature on the Medal of Honor citation that would be read. Billy Thompson stood at attention, despite his bandaged hands, surrounded by the 37 soldiers whose lives he had saved. General Eisenhower himself had come to present the medal, having heard the story, and initially refusing to believe it until viewing combat photography that captured parts of Billy's incredible advance. Eisenhower's voice carried across the assembled troops as he read the citation, describing how Private William Robert Thompson, with complete disregard for his own safety, had single-handedly broken an enemy's strong point by pushing a burning tank 400 yards under intense fire. The general paused at several points, seemingly struggling to comprehend what he was reading despite having reviewed it multiple times. When he placed the medal around Billy's neck, Eisenhower asked quietly, "Son, what were you thinking?" Billy's response, overheard by nearby journalists, was simply, "Wasn't thinking, sir, just pushing." The photographs from that day show a young man aged beyond his 19 years. Billy's hands, though healing, showed extensive scarring that would never fully fade. His face bore the 1,000-yard stare common to combat veterans, but his eyes retained something else, a determination that came from Midwest farmland where quitting meant starvation. The other soldiers in the photographs look at Billy not with jealousy over his medal, but with awe reserved for someone who had transcended normal human limitations. What the citations and ceremonies couldn't capture was the aftermath of Billy's action on the German forces. Hauptmann Werner Kruger, who had commanded the German defense, was captured in April 1945. During his interrogation, he provided details that hadn't been known to American forces. The psychological impact of Billy's assault had spread through the entire German division. Soldiers refused to hold positions, convinced that Americans had developed super soldiers who could withstand fire and push tanks with bare hands. Kruger admitted that he had executed 2 of his own men for desertion, but even that hadn't stopped the collapse of morale. The German High Command had actually issued a special bulletin about the incident, trying to convince their troops that it had been exaggerated propaganda. They claimed the tank had been motorized, that multiple American soldiers had been involved, that the distance had been much shorter. But too many German soldiers had witnessed it firsthand. The story spread through Wehrmacht ranks, growing with each telling. By war's end, German soldiers surrendering to American forces would sometimes ask if they were surrendering to the unit with the man who pushed a burning tank. Billy's recovery was its own battle. The nerve damage in his hands meant he had to relearn basic tasks. Holding a pencil took 3 months. Writing his name took 6. The Army wanted to discharge him, but Billy refused, determined to return to his unit. He spent hours each day in rehabilitation, pushing through pain that would have broken most men. The nurses reported finding him at night, tears streaming down his face as he forced his damaged fingers through flexibility exercises, determined to regain function. The letters Billy wrote home during recovery, discovered decades later, revealed the psychological toll of his actions. He suffered from nightmares where he was still pushing the tank, but could never reach the German lines. Trapped in an eternal advance through fire and smoke, he wrote to his mother about the German soldiers he had killed, wondering if they had families, if they had been farmers like him before the war. The Medal of Honor fell heavy around his neck. He wrote, weighted with the lives he had taken as much as those he had saved. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, Billy had recovered enough to rejoin his unit for occupation duty. His arrival caused a sensation. Soldiers who had only heard the story wanted to see the man who had done the impossible. Billy found himself uncomfortable with the attention, preferred to focus on helping German civilians rebuild their destroyed farms. His farming background made him invaluable in teaching German families how to maximize crop yields from war-torn fields. Former enemies found themselves learning from the same hands that had pushed a burning tank through their lines. An incident in June 1945 demonstrated Billy's character beyond combat. His unit encountered a group of German veterans, former Wehrmacht soldiers trying to return home. Among them was Hans Müller, the Unteroffizier who had witnessed Billy's assault. Müller recognized Billy immediately, his scarred hands unmistakable. What followed was one of the war's most remarkable moments of reconciliation. Mueller approached Billy, saluted, and in broken English said, "You showed us what real courage looks like. We were soldiers following orders. You were a hero following conscience." Billy's response, translated by an interpreter, became legend among occupation forces. He told Mueller that courage wasn't pushing a burning tank. Courage was choosing to rebuild instead of seeking revenge, choosing to plant crops instead of laying mines, choosing to shake hands instead of making fists. He then helped Mueller write a letter to American authorities, vouching for his character and helping him get released to return to his family farm. The two men, who had tried to kill each other months before, exchanged farming advice that both would use for decades after. The Army documented Billy's techniques for pushing the tank, hoping to incorporate them into training. Engineers tried to recreate his feat under controlled conditions. They used fresh soldiers, multiple men, better handholds, and cooler metal. None could replicate what Billy had done. The conclusion was that his success came from a combination of factors that couldn't be taught. Farm boy's strength, intuitive understanding of mechanical leverage, extraordinary pain tolerance, and most importantly, a complete commitment to saving his fellow soldiers regardless of personal cost. Billy returned to Kansas in December 1945, arriving at the same train station he had left from 3 years earlier. The entire town had turned out to welcome him home. The local newspaper ran a headline, "Farm boy who moved mountains returns home." But Billy slipped away from the celebration early, walking alone to his family's farm. His younger brother found him in the barn, running his scarred hands over a tractor engine, relearning to feel machinery that didn't burn, that wasn't surrounded by death. The transition to civilian life proved difficult. Billy would wake at night, sweating, pushing against bedroom walls, thinking they were tank armor. Loud noises sent him diving for cover. The smell of diesel fuel made him vomit. But gradually, with the same determination that had pushed a tank through German lines, Billy rebuilt his life. He married his high school sweetheart, Sarah, in 1947. She later said that Billy's scarred hands were the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, because they represented the lives he had saved. Billy rarely spoke about the war, and never about his Medal of Honor unless directly asked. When the local school invited him to speak to students, he talked not about combat, but about responsibility, about how ordinary people could do extraordinary things when others depended on them. He would hold up his scarred hands and say, "These hands have pushed tanks and planted wheat. The wheat was harder. Destroying is easy. Growing is hard. Choose to grow something." In 1965, 20 years after the war, Billy received an unexpected visitor, Werner Kruger. The former Hauptmann who had commanded the German defense had traveled to Kansas to meet the man who had defeated him. The two aging veterans sat on Billy's porch, sharing beer in silence more than words. Finally, Kruger said, "I've thought about that day for 20 years. I commanded veterans, experienced soldiers with every advantage. You were a boy with a rifle. You won because you weren't fighting for a conquest or ideology. You were fighting for the men beside you. That's why you could push when physics said you couldn't." Billy Thompson died in 2001, age 76. His funeral attended by hundreds, including surviving members of his unit, German veterans he had befriended, and generations of families whose fathers and grandfathers had survived because a farm boy refused to let them die. His Medal of Honor is displayed at the Pentagon, but his greatest monument is the 37 families that exist because he chose to push instead of retreat. The final analysis of Billy's action came from an unexpected source. In 2010, sports scientists using modern computer modeling tried to understand how Billy had achieved the physically impossible. Their conclusion was that the human body, under extreme stress and with absolute mental commitment, could access strength reserves normally locked away to prevent self-destruction. Billy had somehow overridden every safety mechanism in his body, trading permanent damage for temporary superhuman capability. But the scientists admitted this only explained the physical aspect. What made Billy push in the first place? What gave him a will to continue when his body was literally burning? Remained beyond scientific understanding. The story of Billy Thompson reminds us that heroism isn't the absence of fear or pain, but action despite overwhelming odds. A 19-year-old farm boy from Kansas changed the course of battle, saved 37 lives, and proved that determination could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. His legacy lives not in military manuals, but in the lesson that ordinary people can achieve the extraordinary when they refuse to accept defeat, when they push forward despite the fire, when they choose their brothers' lives over their own. Thank you for joining us to discover this incredible story of courage, sacrifice, and the power of human will. When ordinary people do extraordinary things, their stories deserve to be remembered and shared. If Billy's story moved you, please subscribe and share with others who need reminding that heroes come from unexpected places. What other untold stories of courage from history would you like us to uncover? Leave your thoughts below. And remember that inside every ordinary person lies the potential for extraordinary heroism. Until next time, keep pushing forward, no matter how heavy the load or how hot the fire.